Historic high-stakes peace talks are underway between Afghanistan officials and the Taliban. Both sides held their first direct meeting in Qatar yesterday as they work to end nearly 2 decades of war. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and top U.S. envoy Khalilzad helped kick off the talks this weekend. This comes after the U.S. negotiated its landmark peace deal with the Taliban in February, laying the groundwork for withdrawing troops from the country. However, violence and deadly attacks continue in Afghanistan, even as talks enter a new phase. So for more on this, we want to bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab to talk a little bit more about it. You're joining us from London. This stage is a long time in coming, much longer than was anticipated. So just bring us up to speed. Give us the latest developments, what's happening in Qatar, and what are Afghan and Taliban leaders focusing on right now?
Yeah, hey, good to talk to you guys. Yeah, look, this is historic. We have the U.S.-backed Afghan government meeting face-to-face with its bitter enemy, the Taliban, who are there after negotiating a deal with their bitter enemy, the United States, who are also in Doha monitoring these talks. This is extraordinary, but we have to really just underscore how fragile they are as well. You know, these talks were supposed to start in February, as soon as the Trump administration signed that deal with the Taliban. But here we are, it's September, and this really just underscores how fragile these talks are and really how acrimonious they're likely to be. Now, a lot has been made over the past few months over things like prisoner exchanges, but the real issue here is the anger, the distrust, and the anguish that many at this table feel. I mean, these are Afghans talking to fellow Afghans, countrymen who have been fighting each other for so long, and now they're trying to make peace. So there's a lot of emotion in the room, and yes, there is some hope that there may be a real chance for peace, but a very clear understanding, Anne-Marie, that all of this could fall apart at any time.
And Imtiaz, women's rights is a major topic of discussion during these peace talks. Many Afghan women are deservedly worried about their future following years of oppressive policies under the Taliban. We've also seen many prominent Afghan women being targeted in attacks across Kabul as these talks continue. So what can you tell us about this? Are women being represented, and are they being heard during these negotiations?
Yeah, Vlad, it is a massive issue, and it's certainly a concern not only for Afghan women, but really for the world. So many countries invested in the future of Afghanistan. Now, what I can tell you is that the Afghan government's delegation from Kabul has traveled with 3 women who are taking part in that delegation, will be part of the negotiations. We also know that women journalists from Afghanistan have also traveled to Doha to report on these talks, something that would have been unheard of just a generation ago. And the rights of women will, of course, most certainly be part of these negotiations. But perhaps unsurprisingly, there are no women making up part of the Taliban delegation. In fact, when I interviewed a senior Taliban commander last year, a man by the name of Sohail Shaheen, he muttered support for the rights of women as part of any kind of peace deal, be it in education or in the workforce. But, he really offered very little in terms of concrete proposals for the rights of women in a country where the Taliban form part of the government, if not lead the government. But let's also not lose sight of the fact, and certainly what you just said as well, that in this very moment, the rights of women in Afghanistan, frankly, are extremely precarious. They're certainly nowhere near what President George W. Bush promised when he led the invasion of Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks. There have been some incremental gains, but so many women have for so long been left out and left, frankly, to fend for themselves. And with so many, or rather so few at the negotiating table, the concern is that they will continue to be left out of the conversation about their own country's future, a country which today they have very few rights, and frankly, many have very little hope about what's to come.
Imtiaz, in the lead up to you, we talked about the fact that even after the peace deal in February, we saw violence, we saw bloodshed, we saw attacks. Are there any plans to hammer out a permanent ceasefire and also to ensure that in a time of perhaps a little bit of instability, growth, change, there isn't an opportunity for terror groups to get in there, like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head there, Anne-Marie. I mean, somebody who spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, lived there for a couple of years, it really pains me to say this, but violence is a regular and frequent part of people's lives there. And a lot of the horrors and miseries that Afghans experience is never something that makes it a headline that we hear about, even though, of course, a lot of it does, but often really only some of the most extreme violence. And yes, there's a lot of talk about ceasefires, but far too often, for your average Afghan, it's just that, a word, and has very little meaning in practice for them. And, we have to remember that Afghanistan is an extraordinary complex place. So, it's not just a place where you have the U.S. fighting the Taliban. It's Afghan forces fighting Taliban forces. It's warlords in one area fighting warlords in another area. There are clan-to-clan rivalries, family-to-family fighting, and, of course, there are frequent attacks on minorities. But, Anne-Marie, you also mentioned ISIS. This is a major concern in Afghanistan. ISIS is trying to grow a foothold there. It has committed horrific atrocities there. And so from a fighting perspective, there is so much to undo in Afghanistan. And these talks in Doha are aimed at trying to end at least some of that. But as we've been saying, it's going to be extremely difficult.
And Imtiaz, what do these peace talks mean for U.S. troops withdrawing from Afghanistan, and what's the timeline?
Yeah, hey, listen, it's already happening. At the start of this year, there were 8,600 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Those forces have gradually been pulling out since that deal signed between the Trump administration and the Taliban back in February. President Trump himself has promised to have just 4,000 U.S. troops left stationed in Afghanistan by November, before the election. If that happens, it'll be the smallest U.S. footprint in Afghanistan since the beginning of the war over 19 years ago. Now, the government in Kabul isn't happy about this. They see a U.S. military presence as vital to Afghanistan's security and, quite frankly, maintaining their own influence in Afghanistan. The Taliban, of course, wants all U.S. troops gone and has continued to question the idea of any kind of U.S. intelligence force remaining once conventional forces leave. Whatever the case, this is the closest we've come to ever ending America's longest war. But the questions remain, is Afghanistan better off than when the U.S. troops first arrived 19 years ago? And perhaps more importantly, will this country see meaningful peace after the last troops leave? It's hoped that these talks in Doha will be able to at least answer that last question. Anne-Marie, Vlad.
All right, Imtiaz, thank you as always, my friend. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.